Andrew J. MacElroy was born in 1876, exactly 100 years after the birth of our country, and the year of Custer's last stand. He was a member of the class of 1898 at Cornell University. Just after college, he served as a popular principal of Southside High in Rockville Center, New York. One student wrote,
"One of my first happy recollections of my childhood in Rockville Center was seeing Mr. MacElroy have a snowball fight with some of the students at the school. I was just a little city girl from Brooklyn, and I thought he was just wonderful. Oh, and then later, how I cried when he was no longer principal. Now, I'm happy to say I am a proud grandmother of handsome Christopher James. Happy holidays to you, Mr. MacElroy, and to all your family. Adele."
Later, he would also serve as chairman of the Rockville Center School Board. For most of his life, he was in the publishing business. In 1906, he traveled around the world, including across Siberia, for several publications. He ended up as the owner and editor of Acorn Publishing, which published a variety of works, including the National Achievement Tests and the Long Island News and the Owl, a publication that still exists today. Andrew MacElroy enlisted as a private in the U.S. Army Infantry in 1915, shortly after the outbreak of the First World War in Europe. He tried to get into the newly established Flying Corps to train as a pilot, but was repeatedly refused. At 40, he was too old and had bad eyesight. By 1917, the British Army was hungry for new men, particularly those interested in flying. When the U.S. entered the war upon the sinking of the Lusitania, by then, Lieutenant MacElroy was assigned to the British and trained as an aviator. Lieutenant MacElroy ended up cracking up more than a few planes on takeoff or landing without breaking any bones. While he enlisted as a private, he would leave the service only 4 years later as a major. He co-wrote several highly praised manuals and helped to write the definitive government history of aviation in the Great War. We don't know how many Germans, if any, the major may have shot down, but we know he served more than honorably. So honorably that he was decorated for his actions by the award of the Distinguished Service Order by King George V. That decoration was signed by no less than Winston Churchill, who was listed as the principal Secretary of State having the Department of War for the time being. Churchill would, of course, go on to be the greatest leader of the 20th century. And that was not the only tie the Major, as he was known, would have with the greater Churchill family. Six years later, in 1925, the Major would marry Churchill's distant cousin, my grandmother, Jeanette Robinson Wells. And a decade later, he gave away my mother when she and my father were married. Beginning before the Great War and going into the early 1960s and the Kennedy administration, the Major corresponded with governors, past presidents, and other leaders. He would offer advice and tell them just what he thought about world affairs and political matters. Often, they wrote back, politely. At least once, they used the communications as a means to hit him up for money for a good cause, as in this 1948 letter from Eleanor Roosevelt soliciting for the United Jewish Appeal. At least once, they really told him what they thought, as in this letter from Eleanor's uncle, the former president, Teddy Roosevelt.
Dear Mr. MacElroy, I am really sorry to get your letter. I can only say emphatically that I do not agree with you and that you will finally come to my opinion.
Colonel Roosevelt had just returned from his exploration of the Amazon, which nearly killed him. The colonel scolded the major for urging that progressives and independent Republicans should unite behind a Republican to defeat the Democrats in the next election. Teddy Roosevelt would have none of it. He wanted to be president again. Throughout the remainder of his life, Major MacElroy suffered from the effects of frostbite in his hands, resulting from his wartime flying experience. At times, he also suffered from what today would be known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. After multiple letters to government officials, and perhaps a little political clout, he was declared 56% disabled and awarded $56 per month. In just a few years, that was reduced by 15% to less than $48 a month. The Major was a civic leader, as shown in this newspaper article about his induction as president of the Rockville Center Kiwanis Club. He was listed in the 1936 Who's Who in America. He ran twice unsuccessfully for public office, once in the 1920s for state assembly, and later in the 40s for mayor of Rockville Center. The Major served as chairman of the local Reconstruction Council from 1942 to 1946. I remember the Major would play with my favorite rooster by holding his hat like a toreador holds his cape to bait the rooster to charge, which he obligingly always did. We played golf together when I was a teenager and he was in his mid-80s. I remember hitting towering drives into the woods and hitting my next shot into the nearest sand trap. He went straight down the fairway in short shots. I don't remember who won, which probably means the Major did. The Major was a good man. When my Uncle Webby needed a job after his release from the Four Winds Hospital and electric shock therapy, the Major employed him. That employment would continue for the rest of my uncle's working life. Growing up, every Thanksgiving our family would take about a 50-minute drive from Greenwich, Connecticut to have Thanksgiving dinner at the Major's Club in Rockville Center, Long Island. Each year, I remember he would wrestle the check from my father. When we returned to his home, the Major would disappear upstairs to his bedroom to watch the Army-Navy football game on his tiny rabbit ears TV.
Army's big moment comes just after the start of the second half. Dick Eckert heaves a long crossfield pass to Tom Culver, a 55-yard gain.
When allowed, I would join him. As I grew older, I realized he was retreating from my grandmother, a staunch teetotaler, for a little nip. My suspicion that the Major enjoyed an occasional drink was confirmed when researching this piece. I found an otherwise complimentary and charming piece about him in a publication of his fraternity at Cornell. In the early 1960s, his Cornell fraternity bulletin provided as follows. We never knew just when Brother MacElroy would show up. He was about 84 when he started coming back for football weekends. He and his driver would come up from Long Island and stay at the Statler Hotel on campus.
I give you a toast, ladies and gentlemen.
They would show up in time for cocktails on Friday and disappear Sunday morning for the long drive back. Reports from the campus police were that they failed to negotiate a few turns on campus and drove over more than one curb near the Statler. It should be noted that no one was ever hurt on these weekends. My sister Binny have many fond memories of the Major.
Marvelous remembrance of Grandpa MacElroy was a time when he came out to visit in San Francisco, and this must have been 1961, and offered to take us out to dinner, a wonderful fancy place. I happened to be about 8.5 months pregnant with Brian. Like a good fellow, when the music started after we'd finished dinner, Grandpa invited me to go on the dance floor and dance with him. And the problem with that was, with my 8.5 months pregnancy, he came up to my chest and I was wearing heels. I have no idea how he found where to steer me around the dance floor, because Brian and I must have outweighed him by quite a bit. We had a wonderful time and made no collisions and had lots of laughter. It's a very treasured memory of him, that he was brave enough to take on this great barge and direct it around the dance floor. He was a dear fellow and a wonderful grandfather. The Major died at 87, the year I graduated from high school.
His passing was recognized in the moving ceremony with full military honors at the Pine Lawn, Long Island Military Cemetery, where he was interred. The Major's services would mark the last funeral for our family that difficult year that saw the passing of my grandmother, my brother Jim, Annie Tiernan, who worked in 2 generations of Finn homes for over 30 years and did so much to raise and nurture my siblings and me. And Mayo, my childhood dog. The ensuing years saw the arrival of the next generation and many happier times.
I give you a toast, ladies and gentlemen.
I give you a toast, ladies and gentlemen. I give you a toast, ladies and gentlemen. I give you a toast, ladies and gentlemen.